It was a warm Saturday morning, and Daniel had planned a quiet day at home. He wanted to make himself a cup of coffee, sit in his small backyard garden, and maybe read a book. His week had been long and tiring, and he was looking forward to some peaceful time. The sun was shining, the air was fresh, and for once, nothing seemed urgent. But that peace didn't last long, as Daniel poured hot water over the coffee grounds. He heard strange noises coming from above his ceiling. At first, he thought it might be birds landing on the roof or maybe the wind rattling some loose tiles. But the sounds were heavier thuds, footsteps, the scraping of metal. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like people walking up. There. He put his cup down, stepped out into his backyard, and tilted his head upward. His eyes widened. There, on top of his roof, were two men wearing bright safety vests and hard hats. One of them was kneeling down, holding some kind of metal bracket, while the other was drilling into the roof tiles. Dust was falling with every rotation of the drill. "Hey!" Daniel shouted, his voice sharp with shock. "What are you doing up there?" One of the men glanced down, squinting in the sunlight, and then casually replied, installing repeaters. For the neighborhood Wi-Fi, Daniel was frozen for a second. Installing what? He had never heard of such a thing. He took a step closer, shading his eyes with one hand. "On my roof? Without asking me?" The man with the drill stopped for a moment, resting his elbow on his knee. "Yeah, HOA approved it. President said it was all cleared." Daniel felt a wave of irritation rise in his chest. His homeowners association HOA was known for doing annoying things, like sending warning letters if your grass was 2 inches too tall. But this was new. "I didn't approve anything," Daniel said firmly. "Can't just walk onto my property and start drilling holes." The worker shrugged as if it wasn't his problem. "Sir, we just follow the orders we get," the HOA told us. "It's part of the community internet upgrade. You'll get better Wi-Fi after this, so it's a win-win. A win-win." Daniel didn't think so. He quickly walked inside to grab his phone and called the HOA office. After a couple of rings, the HOA president, Mrs. Turner, picked up. She had that sharp, condescending tone she always used when speaking to him, as if she was a teacher scolding a stubborn child. "Yes, Daniel," she said almost impatiently. "There are men on my roof," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice calm, drilling into it. "They say they're installing Wi-Fi repeaters for the neighborhood. I never gave permission." "What is going on?" "Oh, that," Mrs. Turner replied as if it was a minor thing. "Yes, we're rolling out a community internet plan. Every few houses will have a repeater installed to boost the signal. It's for everyone's benefit, and it was approved in the last meeting." Daniel frowned. "I didn't approve it. And you can't just use my property without asking." Mrs. Turner's voice tightened. "Daniel, it's part of the HOA agreement. We're allowed to make changes that improve community services. It's harmless. Installation will be done in an hour, and you'll hardly notice it's there." Daniel glanced back at the two workers still drilling. "I'll notice the holes in my roof. And I'll notice the strangers walking around without permission. This is my property. I have the right to say no." There was a pause, then a light sigh from Mrs. Turner. "Daniel, you're always so difficult. We're talking about faster. Internet for everyone. Can't you be a team player?" That last sentence made Daniel's blood boil. Being a team player doesn't mean letting you trespass and attach equipment to my house without consent. But Mrs. Turner was done arguing. "Yeah, look, it's already in progress. If we stop now, it'll cost the association extra money. Just let them finish. You'll thank us later." With that, she hung up. Daniel stood there with the phone still in his hand, staring at it in disbelief. She had just brushed him off like his opinion didn't matter at all. His roof, his property, apparently none of that mattered to them. He walked back outside, looking up at the workers again. He wanted to tell them to get down immediately, but he knew they were just doing their job and wouldn't want to get in trouble with their employer. He sighed and decided to let them finish for the moment, but his mind was already spinning with questions. Why hadn't they even asked him first? Did they think his roof was public property just because he lived in an HOA community? Is there even a clause in the HOA agreement that allowed them to do this? He couldn't remember anything like that. As the morning went on, the noises continued. He could hear the heavy thumps when they moved the ladder, the worry drill, the occasional clang of metal on metal. He watched as they hoisted a rectangular device about the size of a small suitcase onto the roof. Thick black cables trailed behind it, connecting to a metal box. The smell of hot tar and dust drifted down. Every so often, Daniel saw bits of roof material flutter down onto his driveway. He picked one up. It was a small fragment of a tile broken off by the drilling. That was actual damage. By the time they were done, the two men climbed down, gave him a brief nod, and drove off without another word. Daniel stepped back to get a better look at his roof. Right near the chimney, there was a silver metal pole with a flat dish on top, pointing toward the street. A thick black cable ran along his shingles, disappearing down the side of his house into the wall. He didn't like it, not one bit. It felt invasive. It was like someone had planted something on his property without his consent, and now it was. Just there later that afternoon, Daniel noticed something else. A small box was mounted on the side of his house, right under the eaves. A cable from the repeater went directly into it, and from there, into his electrical system. That meant they were using his electricity to power the repeater. That was the first sign that this wasn't harmless. He walked over to the box, crouched down, and read the label. It had the HOA's name on it, but nothing about it being part of his own service. His mind started to connect the dots. If they were drawing power from his home, he would be paying for it. Maybe it was a small amount, but still it was his money. That evening, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, his coffee now cold, and pulled out his HOA agreement. He read every line, scanning for anything that gave them the right to install equipment on private property. There were clauses about maintaining fences, keeping lawns neat, and not painting houses in unapproved colors. But nothing about mounting devices on someone's roof without permission. He realized Mrs. Turner had simply assumed he wouldn't fight back. Maybe she thought it wasn't worth his time to complain. But Daniel wasn't the type to ignore something like this. If anything, their arrogance made him more determined to push back. The next day, he started making notes. He listed the date and time of the installation, the names of the workers he had asked before they left, and took photos of the equipment from different angles. He even recorded a short video showing the cable going into his electrical panel. If the HOA thought he was going to let this slide, they had picked the wrong neighbor. For now, though, he didn't make a scene. He would watch, wait, and gather every bit of evidence. He had a feeling this wasn't the last time the HOA would underestimate him. What Daniel didn't know yet was that this small incident, 2 workers on his roof without permission, was just the beginning of a much bigger battle. A battle that would end with the HOA paying him every single month for something they thought they could get for free. For the first couple of days after the strange installation, Daniel tried to ignore the repeater on his roof. He told himself it was just an eyesore, something he could pretend wasn't there. But slowly, he began to notice little things that made it impossible to forget. It started with the sound. At night, when everything in the house was quiet, a faint humming came from above. It wasn't loud enough to keep him awake, but it was constant, like the gentle buzz of a refrigerator running in the background. Once you noticed it, you couldn't unhear it. Sometimes, when the wind was still, it even had a faint clicking sound, like a small fan turning on and off. Daniel would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about how this wasn't something he had chosen to put there, had been forced on him. Then came the electricity bill. Daniel was in the habit of checking his utility usage every month. He wasn't obsessive about it, but he liked to know where his money was going. When the bill arrived 2 weeks later, he opened it without thinking and nearly dropped it. It was noticeably higher than usual, almost $18 more than his average monthly cost. At first he thought maybe it was just the air conditioning, but the weather had been mild. There was no reason for such a jump. He sat down at his desk and logged into his online utility account. The detailed breakdown showed an odd spike in electricity usage during the hours he was normally at work. Didn't make sense. He always turned everything off before leaving in the morning. Then he remembered the little metal box on the side of his house, the repeater. It had been running non-stop since the day they installed it. That had to be the reason. Daniel felt his irritation flare up again. He wasn't just annoyed anymore. was angry. They had trespassed onto his property, damaged his roof, installed equipment without permission, and now they were making him pay for the electricity to run it. And the worst part, he acted like it was no big deal, as if he was being petty for even noticing. Determined to address it, Daniel attended the next HOA meeting. It was held in the community clubhouse, a small beige building with stiff chairs. Arranged in neat rows, the fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly as neighbors settled in, some with coffee cups. Others flipping through the meeting agenda. Daniel sat near the front, waiting for his turn to speak. The HOA board members sat behind a long folding table, their nameplates neatly placed in front of them. Mrs. Turner sat in the middle, wearing her usual fake smile that somehow managed to look both polite and dismissive at the same time. When the open discussion section began, Daniel raised his hand. Mrs. Turner nodded in his direction. "Yes, Daniel. Go ahead." He stood up. "Want to talk about the Wi-Fi repeater that was installed on my roof last month without my permission. Not only was it unauthorized, but I've also noticed my electricity bill has gone up since then. That equipment is using my power, and I'm paying for it." Several people in the room glanced at each other, murmuring quietly. Mrs. Turner's smile didn't fade, but her voice had that same condescending edge as before. "Daniel, as we explained, the repeater is part of the Community Internet Improvement Project. Cost to you is negligible, probably a few cents a month at most." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "My bill went up by almost $20. That's nice. Not negligible. Even if it was just a few cents, it's still my electricity. You didn't ask for permission. You didn't offer compensation. You just decided my property was yours to use." One of the other board members, a man named Greg, leaned forward. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. This benefits the whole neighborhood. Everyone's internet is faster now, including yours." Daniel shook his head. "That's not the point. The point is that you can't just take something from someone without asking. You wouldn't let me come into your garage and plug in my equipment without permission. So why is my roof any different?" Greg, he gave a short laugh. "Because it's for the community. You're acting selfish over a tiny increase in your bill." The word selfish hit Daniel like a spark to dry grass. Selfish. He was the one having his property used without consent, and somehow he was the bad guy. Ain't. He clenched his fists, but forced himself to keep his voice steady. "About being selfish. It's about respecting property rights. If you wanted to put equipment on my house, the least you could have done was ask." Mrs. Turner leaned back in her chair, her expression cool. "Daniel, the board has already approved this project. It's not up for debate now. If you have a formal complaint, submit it in writing. Otherwise, let's move on to the next topic." Daniel sat back down, his jaw tight. They weren't going to do anything. They didn't care about his concerns. Worse, they were making him out to be unreasonable in front of his neighbors. After the meeting ended, as people shuffled out, a few residents approached Daniel quietly. One of them, a middle-aged man named Peter, said, "I heard what you said about the electricity bill. I think mine went up too. I've got one of those boxes on my house as well." Another neighbor, a woman named Linda, added, "Same here. But honestly, I just figured it wasn't worth the fight. You know how the HOA is." Daniel nodded slowly. That was exactly the problem. The HOA counted on people thinking it wasn't worth the fight. They knew most residents wouldn't bother to push back over something that seemed small. But to Daniel, it wasn't small. It was the principle. That night, as he sat in his living room, he thought about the situation again and again. He could take them to small claims court, but the process would be long and tiring. He could call the utility company, but they would probably say there was nothing they could do. And then an idea started forming in his mind. Small, quiet idea at first, but it grew stronger the more he thought about it. They could use his roof and electricity without asking. Maybe he could use that against them. Maybe he could find a way to turn this invasion into something that worked in his favor. He didn't smile often when dealing with the HOA. But that night, as the idea took shape, the corners of his mouth turned upward just a little. He wasn't going to just complain anymore. He was going to make them regret underestimating him. The next day, Daniel began doing some research. He looked up the exact model of the repeater they had installed and learned how much power it consumed. He also looked into internet service plans, noting how they could be set up to feed into multiple connections. He made calls to a few providers asking detailed questions about commercial service rates, data sharing, and billing. The more he learned, the more possible his plan seemed. It wouldn't be easy and it would require some precise timing, but if it worked, the HOA would be forced to pay him instead of the other way around. Still, Daniel didn't rush, kept his idea to himself, acting as though he had accepted the situation. Meanwhile, he quietly monitored the repeater's activity. Some nights, he even sat in his backyard with a small flashlight, checking the cables and connections just to confirm exactly how the setup worked. The humming from the roof didn't bother him as much anymore. Now, every time he heard it, he thought of it differently, not as an intrusion, but as an opportunity. An opportunity the HOA had handed him on a silver platter without even realizing it. The board had laughed at him, mocked him for bringing up the electricity costs, and labeled him selfish. That was fine. Let them think that. In time, they'd see exactly how selfish he could be, especially when it came to getting paid for what was rightfully his. Daniel didn't know the exact day yet, but he knew one thing for sure. The moment he was ready to act, the HOA would never see it coming. Daniel had always been the kind of man who thought before he acted. He wasn't impulsive, especially when it came to dealing with people who could make his life miserable, like the HOA board. That was why he spent the next couple of weeks planning his move very carefully. Every night after work, he would sit at his desk, open his laptop, and research internet service providers. He compared packages, read the fine print, and learned how the repeater system worked in more detail. The HOAS setup was simple but clever. Each repeater on certain houses boosted the signal from one central provider, making it strong enough for the whole neighborhood. The one on his roof was directly connected to the main line, meaning it was a critical part of the system. Without his repeater, the signal to almost half the community would weaken or disappear entirely, Daniel realized. This gave him more power than he had thought. If he controlled the internet flowing into that repeater, he could essentially control a big chunk of the HOA's network. That's when the real plan took shape. One Tuesday afternoon, he called his current provider and asked a simple question. If I cancel my plan, how quickly can you disconnect the service? The answer? Within 24 hours. He smiled to himself. That was exactly what he needed to know. Next, he called a different provider, one that specialized in business and commercial internet plans. He told them he wanted a high-speed line with a static IP and unlimited data. It was expensive, much more than what a normal household would pay, but that was part of the plan. The sales rep on the phone explained the rates, and Daniel wrote down every number. Then he asked if the service could be set up so that all connected devices would run through his account, even if they belonged to other people. The rep confirmed it was possible, as long as he was the account holder and the connection originated from his property. Perfect. He scheduled the installation for the following week, making sure it would happen on a day when most people would be at work, especially the HOA board members. On the morning of the installation, a technician in a white van pulled up in front of his house. The man introduced himself as Sam, a friendly guy with a beard and a clipboard. "What are we setting up today?" Sam asked, as he carried a ladder to the side of the house. "High-speed commercial internet," Daniel said with a smile. "I need it wired directly into that box up there." He pointed to the metal box under the eaves, the one the HOA's repeater was connected to. Sam raised an eyebrow. "You want your new service going straight into that?" "That's right," Daniel said casually. "I've got a network set up that runs through it. I just need everything feeding from my new connection." Sam shrugged. "As long as you're the property owner and you're paying for the service, that's fine with us." Within a few hours, the work was done. The repeater on his roof was now running entirely on Daniel's new commercial plan. His old residential plan was still active for the moment, but he didn't intend to keep it for long. The next day, Daniel called his old provider and canceled the service. They warned him there would be a 24-hour disconnection period, but he didn't mind. He knew what was going to happen once it went offline. Sure enough, the following evening, his phone rang. It was Mrs. Turner. "Daniel," she began without even saying hello, "we've been getting reports from residents that their internet is down. Do you know anything about this?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, trying to keep his voice calm. That's strange. My internet is working fine. Well, the technicians traced the outage to the repeater on your property. Apparently it's not receiving the signal from the central provider anymore, she said, her tone tight. Oh, that, Daniel said lightly. Yes, I switched my provider yesterday. And my roof, my electricity, my choice. The repeater's now running through my service. There was a long pause on the other end. You switched providers without notifying us? I didn't think I had to, Daniel replied. After all, you didn't notify me when you installed it. Her voice sharpened. Daniel, you can't just change the setup like that. The HOA system depends on the original provider's network. That's not my concern, he said evenly. If you want to keep using my property to run your internet equipment, you'll need to work with the service I've chosen. By the way, is a premium commercial plan that costs me quite a bit more than my old one. She exhaled sharply. Are you saying you expect us to pay for your internet? Daniel smiled faintly. Not for my internet, for the service your equipment is now using. Think of it as an infrastructure leasing fee. You're using my space, my electricity, and now my internet. That comes at a cost. This is absurd, Mrs. Turner snapped. You're holding the community's internet hostage. No, Daniel said calmly. I'm simply doing what you did to me using my resources without asking. Only now I'm offering you the courtesy of an agreement instead of just taking what I want. She muttered something under her breath, then said, I'll have to discuss this with the board. You do that? Daniel replied. In the meantime, if you want the service to continue, I'll need confirmation by the end of the week. Otherwise, I'll be disconnecting the repeater entirely. They ended the call, and Daniel sat back, feeling the first real taste of satisfaction since this whole mess began. Knew the board would be furious. They would probably call him names, threaten fines, maybe even try to intimidate him. He also knew they were trapped. Without his repeater, at least 40% of the neighborhood would lose their internet connection completely. The residents would complain endlessly, and the board would have to answer for it. He had the upper hand now, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. Over the next 2 days, he heard little from the HOA, but word around the neighborhood traveled fast. Peter, the neighbor who had spoken to him after the last meeting, came. By one evening, I heard what happened, Peter said with a grin. Half the block was without internet yesterday. People were freaking out. You really switched the provider? Daniel chuckled. Yep, and now they have to pay if they want it back. Peter shook his head in disbelief. You've got guts, man. Board's not used to anyone standing up to them. Daniel didn't say it out loud, but he knew this wasn't just about guts. It was about preparation. He had set this up so cleanly that even if the HOA wanted to fight it, they'd have a hard time winning. That weekend, Daniel received an email from Mrs. Turner requesting a private discussion with him and a few board members. He knew this was their attempt to negotiate without involving the entire neighborhood. He accepted the invitation, knowing it was time to lay out the terms. But, in his mind, the meeting wouldn't be about whether they would pay him, it would be about how much. The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday evening at the small conference room inside the community clubhouse. Daniel arrived a few minutes early, dressed neatly, but not formally, just jeans and a clean shirt. He didn't want to look like he was trying to impress them. He wanted to look comfortable, in control. When he walked in, the room was already set up. A long rectangular table sat in the center with 6 chairs on one side and 1 chair on the other, clearly meant for him. On the HOA side sat Mrs. Turner, her ever-present smug expression firmly in place. Along with Greg, the board member who had laughed at him before, and to others Daniel didn't know by name. They had folders in front of them and a pitcher of water sat at the end of the table. Daniel, Mrs. Turner greeted, her tone polite but cool. Thank you for coming. Daniel gave a short nod and took his seat. Let's get straight to it. Greg leaned forward, clasping his hands. We're here because your recent actions have disrupted the community internet service. This has caused multiple complaints from residents, and the board feels it's in everyone's best interest to resolve this quickly. Daniel sat back. I agree. That's why I'm here. But let's be clear. My actions didn't disrupt anything. The HOA's dependence on my property without an agreement is what caused the disruption. Mrs. Turner's smile tightened. You altered the equipment's connection without our approval. Daniel tilted his head. Just like you installed the equipment without mine. There was a brief silence. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Daniel reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. He placed it on the table and opened it slowly, revealing printed photographs, clear shots of the repeater on his roof, the metal box under the eaves, and the thick cable running into his electrical panel. These, he said, sliding the photos toward them, were taken the day you installed the equipment. You'll notice the cable runs directly into my power supply. I also have utility records showing the increase in my electric bill starting that exact week. It's called using someone's resources without permission. Greg looked at the SD photos but didn't touch them. Even if that's true, the cost is minimal. Daniel cut him off, his voice firm but calm. Minimal isn't the point. Property rights are. You can't install something on private property, use my power to run it, and then act like it's no big deal. If we're talking about minimal costs, you should have no problem paying me to continue providing the service. Mrs. Turner straightened in her chair. What exactly are you asking for? Daniel pulled out another sheet of paper. This is my proposal. You want to keep the repeater on my roof. You want it to keep running through my internet service. And you pay me a monthly fee, $250. That covers the commercial internet plan, electricity usage, and an inconvenience charge for taking up space on my property. Greg's eyes widened. $250 a month? It's outrageous. Daniel didn't flinch. Not really. That's less than what it would cost you to remove the repeater, relocate it, run new wiring, and compensate other residents for service interruptions during the move. Plus, my location is ideal for signal coverage. I picked it for a reason. Mrs. Turner's lips pressed into a thin line. You could simply remove it and place it elsewhere. Daniel nodded. You could, but I've looked at the layout of the neighborhood. You'd need 2 new repeater locations to replace mine, and neither spot is as effective. The cost of installation alone would be over $3,000, and you'd still have to pay 2 sets of property owners for the use of their roofs. One of the quieter board members spoke up for the first time. You seem to have done your homework. Daniel smiled slightly. I have, and I'm prepared to take this further if necessary. I've already contacted a property rights attorney, and I'm more than ready to file a complaint for trespassing, unauthorized use of property, and damages. If I do that, I'll be asking for back pay starting from the day the repeater was installed. Double quotes. Mrs. Turner's eyes narrowed. You wouldn't actually sue the HOA. Daniel leaned forward. Try me. I have every piece of evidence I need. Photos. Utility bills. Even the names of the installation workers who admitted the HOA sent them without my consent. And in court, you'd have to explain to a judge why you thought it was okay to attach your equipment to someone's property without permission. I'm guessing that wouldn't go well for you. The room went quiet again. Daniel let the silence hang there, knowing it would make them uncomfortable. He poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher, taking a slow sip before continuing. I'm not here to cause chaos, he said finally. I'm offering you an easy solution. You pay me a reasonable fee, I keep the repeater connected. To my commercial service, everyone in the neighborhood keeps their internet, and we avoid legal trouble. That's fair. Greg crossed his arms. Fair for you, maybe? Daniel gave a small shrug. It's also fair for the HOA. You keep the network running without spending thousands to rebuild it elsewhere. You stop risking a lawsuit that you will almost certainly lose. Sounds like a win-win to me. Mrs. Turner exchanged a look. With the other board members, she could tell Daniel wasn't bluffing. His confidence, his preparation, and his calm tone made it clear he had thought through every angle. We'll have to discuss this privately, I said at last. Of course, Daniel replied, standing up. But remember, the clock's ticking. If I don't have an answer by Friday, I'll disconnect the repeater completely. This time it won't just be a temporary outage. He left the meeting without looking back, his footsteps steady and unhurried. That night, Daniel sat on his couch and thought about the conversation. He knew the HOA would try to find a way around paying him, but he also knew they were cornered. Moving the repeater would be expensive and inconvenient, and they would face backlash from residents if the internet went down again. Over the next 2 days, he heard from a few neighbors who had noticed the board members acting tense. Rumors were spreading that the HOA was in negotiations with a homeowner over the internet equipment. No one knew the details, but Daniel didn't care if they figured it out. In fact, he almost hoped they would. It might make the board feel even more pressure to settle. On Friday morning, Daniel received an email from Mrs. Turner. It was short and formal. The board had carefully considered his proposal and was willing to agree to a monthly payment of $200, starting immediately. With back pay for the last 2 months since his provider switch, Daniel read the email twice, then leaned back in, his chair smiling. It wasn't the full $250 he had asked for, but it was still a solid win. More importantly, it was in writing, signed by the HOA president herself. That meant they had acknowledged his ownership of the property and their obligation. To pay him, he typed a short reply. Agreed. I will keep the repeater connected and functioning as long as payments are made on time. Thank you. When he hit send, Daniel felt the kind of satisfaction that came from winning a fight without ever raising his voice. The HOA had underestimated him, tried to bully him, and ended up agreeing to pay him every single month for something they thought they could take for free. The best part, he knew this agreement would be a constant reminder to them that they couldn't just walk over him or anyone else without consequences. And deep down, Daniel also knew that if they ever tried anything like this again, he would be ready. When the first payment from the HOA arrived, Daniel couldn't help but feel a quiet thrill. It wasn't a huge check, $200 for the month, plus $400 for the back pay, but it was money that had come straight from the same people who had once mocked him in front of his neighbors. He looked at the envelope for a long moment before opening it, almost enjoying the symbolism of it. He deposited the check and made a mental note. This was now a steady monthly income, and it was coming without him lifting a finger other than making sure the repeater on his roof stayed plugged into his commercial internet plan. The very thing that had once irritated him was now putting money in his pocket. A few weeks later, Daniel used some of that money to buy something he had been thinking about for years: solar panels. The installation wasn't cheap, but the HOA payments covered a good chunk of the monthly financing. Not only was the internet running through his property, but it was being powered partly by the sunlight hitting his own roof. The irony wasn't lost on him. The HOA was essentially renting his space. In his sunshine, neighbors started noticing the panels. Some asked about the costs, others about the savings. Daniel kept his answers polite and vague, not mentioning the repeater deal. Wasn't trying to hide it out of fear. It was more fun letting the HOA live with the quiet, knowledge that they were paying him every month. The less everyone knew, the less noise there would be. And Daniel preferred it that way at HOA meetings. The dynamic changed. Mrs. Turner still acted like she was in charge, but her tone with Daniel was different, now measured, almost cautious. Greg avoided eye contact most of the time, and when he did speak to Daniel, it was brief and civil. The other board members seemed to understand there was an unspoken rule. Don't pick unnecessary fights with the man whose roof carried a large piece of the community's internet system. Daniel never brought it up at meetings, unless absolutely necessary. He didn't gloat, didn't wave it in their faces. But every month, when that payment arrived, it felt like a quiet victory. There were moments when he almost laughed thinking about how it had all unfolded. The HOA had tried to force their way onto his property, believing he'd either accept it or complain without doing anything serious. They had no idea he would turn the tables in a way that left them dependent on him. The next real test came 6 months later. There was talk in the neighborhood about the HOA considering a switch to a cheaper internet provider. Daniel wasn't worried. He knew that as long as the repeater stayed on his roof, they would need his cooperation. Sure enough, a week later, Mrs. Turner called him. "Daniel," she began, her voice unusually polite. "We're exploring some options to reduce internet costs for the community. If we make a provider change, we'll need to coordinate with you to ensure a smooth transition." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Of course. But you understand that my commercial plan is with a specific provider. If you want to change it, we'll have to renegotiate the agreement." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Renegotiate. Yes, Daniel said evenly. Different provider, different costs, different terms. I'd have to see if it's even worth the trouble for me. Of course, any changes to the setup would have to be approved by me in writing. Mrs. Turner made a strained sound that might have been an attempt at a polite laugh. Well, we'll keep you informed. Daniel knew what that meant. They weren't going to risk pushing him. Sure enough, the provider change never happened. The HOA kept paying him the same amount month after month. With the extra income building up, Daniel started making more upgrades to his home. He replaced the old wooden fence with a tall, modern one that gave him more privacy. He built a small covered deck in the backyard, complete with outdoor lighting and comfortable seating. Sometimes on warm evenings, he'd sit there with a drink, listening to the faint hum of the repeater on his roof, a sound that once annoyed him but now made him think of easy money. Peter, his neighbor, an occasional confidant in these matters, often stopped by. One evening, as they sat outside, Peter said, "You know, you've basically beaten them at their own game. Most people just complain about the HOA, but you actually turned it around on them." Daniel shrugged with a small smile. "Sometimes. The best way to win is to make them need you more than you need them." Peter chuckled. "I bet they hate writing you that check every month." "Oh, I'm sure they do," Daniel replied. "But as long as they keep doing it, I don't really care how they feel about it." The situation remained stable for the next year. Every so often, Daniel would receive an email from Mrs. Turner reminding him of scheduled maintenance for the repeater. She always phrased it carefully, requesting permission rather than informing him like before. The maintenance crew would show up, work for a couple of hours, and leave, making sure not to disturb anything else on his property. That change in attitude was one of the sweetest parts of the whole arrangement. The same people who had once dismissed his concerns now tiptoed around his boundaries. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the respect, or at least the forced respect, that came with holding the upper hand. One afternoon, while Daniel was checking his email, he saw a notice about an upcoming HOA election. Mrs. Turner's position as president was up for a vote. He didn't plan to get involved, but curiosity got the better of him, and he went to the meeting. To his surprise, several residents spoke up about feeling ignored by the board, mentioning how decisions were often made without proper consultation. Daniel kept quiet during that discussion, but he knew exactly what they were talking about. He had lived it. When the votes were counted, Mrs. Turner barely held on to her position. Greg, however, lost his seat on the board entirely. Daniel had no interest in joining the HOA himself, but he couldn't help feeling a small sense of satisfaction watching Greg pack up his papers and leave the table. The payments kept coming. The solar panels kept generating power, and Daniel's commercial internet service ran smoothly. Over time, he almost forgot about the anger and frustration he had felt when the installation first happened. Now, it was just part of his life, a strange, accidental business arrangement that had turned out in his favor. But every so often, when he saw the repeater up there against the sky, he remembered the lesson it had taught him. Never assume you're powerless, just because someone else acts like they're in charge. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about control, about knowing he had taken a situation where he was supposed to be the victim and turned it into something that benefited him every single month. And as long as the HOA needed that repeater, Daniel knew they'd keep coming. Back to him, check in hand, whether they liked it or not. For Daniel, that was enough. He didn't need public recognition. He didn't need to brag. He had his quiet win, his steady income, and the satisfaction of knowing that the people who once thought they could push him around were now paying for the privilege. And in his book, that was the best kind of victory.